a distinguished guest in the North East last week, Mrs. Edwina Currie. She's had a right go to us, hasn't she? She says we're unhealthy, ignorant. I wonder what Steve Cram's got to say about that.
The anger felt in the North last week about remarks made by the newly appointed Junior Health Minister has this week turned into bitter humour.
What does she expect? Look at the price of food. 16 bob a pint.
Edwina Currie told Northerners that the reason they die young is not due to poverty and unemployment, but because they smoke and drink too much and are ignorant about good diets. They should look to the health-conscious South for lessons in how to be healthy.
My impression is that every family could spend less money on things like smoking and perhaps drinking, and could switch that money to better diet, and we would have better health.
This is an outrageous generalisation, surely. Every family is spending too much money on alcohol and tobacco.
I am certain that every family can do something to improve its health care. My family could do something to improve its health care. And we will make progress.
But it is that kind of generalisation that people find so offensive, isn't it?
But if you care about the health of our people, like I do, if you worry about the health of North Country people, my fellow Northerners, as I do, then one has to say these things bluntly.
Mrs. Currie's remarks fly in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's poverty and deprivation, rather than personal health habits, which are the major causes of ill health and early death, and make the poor of the North East twice as likely to die young as the average person in the rest of Britain. Tonight, World in Action reports on the causes of poor health and early death in the North, and on the reaction of those who find Mrs. Currie's recipe for good health too rich. Mrs. Currie's controversial remarks were a reaction to a recent study by this man. Professor Peter Townsend from Bristol University has spent 30 years studying the relationship between poverty and ill health. Professor Townsend accepts that too much drinking, smoking and a poor diet are factors in causing early deaths. But he feels that to concentrate on these is to sidestep the real issues of poverty and deprivation.
It's almost like blaming the victim for the conditions of ill health that prevail, instead of looking very hard at the evidence about poverty and deprivation. The evidence is multitudinous. It goes back over generations in this country and has become particularly strong at the present time. Conditions have worsened in the last few years. They started before the present government, but they've accelerated during these last 7 or 8 years.
Edwina Currie accepts that health in the North has been poor for a long time, but says it has little to do with poverty.
Well, the gap between the north part of the country, very broadly, and the southern part of the country, in terms of health, has been there a very long time. It's been there as long as we've had statistics, certainly in this century. And it's been there at times when there's been very little unemployment, when the north has been booming.
But don't those figures just show that the north has, for a very long time, been poor in relation to the south?
As far as we know, that's been true since the days of Samuel Pepys and back to Elizabeth I, and even earlier than that.
Timely addressed it then, isn't it?
There were complaints for it. Well, it does suggest that perhaps a single government can't put right something that has been a problem for over 400 years.
Mrs. Currie's remarks have been condemned by political enemies and friends alike. A Conservative MP on Teesside, Richard Holt, has demanded that she apologise or resign.
This was a remark which I would not have expected to come from any politician, from a Conservative even less, and from a Conservative minister less still, but from a brand new Conservative minister with no knowledge or grasp of the situation. I was just appalled.
The diet and personal health care of people in the inner cities have been a long-standing concern among church leaders, but some of them regard Mrs. Currie's response to the problem as counterproductive.
I'm sure she has admirable intentions, but it's really no good speaking from Whitehall to people up in Liverpool or Middlesbrough or wherever, because what is said sounds censorious. It sounds, well, we know better in the south, and you poor benighted northerners, you learn from us. And that's no way to teach people.
It's to areas like this that Mrs. Currie advises northerners to look for lessons in how to live long and healthy lives. This is Bromley, southeast of London. It comes out top in a comprehensive survey of health indicators among Greater London boroughs. The average age of people being buried in this local cemetery last week was 76 years, and people who live and work here can expect to survive an average of 8 years longer than those in the deprived parts of the northeast. But Bromley is something else apart from remarkably healthy. It's also remarkably prosperous, coming out near the top of a survey of family incomes.
Go. Well, come on. Go on, keep your feet low. Keep your feet low. Come on, keep going. Keep going. Keep going.
The scene inside the local sports centre seems a good example to anyone.
Keep going. Keep going. Yes. And slow down to a jog.
10, nice and straight. It's front. Get your head in and front and side. Get your head
In private fitness clubs too, the passion for good health seems alive and well.
3.
Well, I come to the gym here at least twice a week, and my husband and I regularly play tennis, so quite a bit of exercise.
Why are you interested in having so much regular exercise?
Really for health reasons, and to keep them trim and to keep as fit as possible.
The whole Benmore family takes fitness seriously, but it doesn't come cheap. Facilities at this centre include sauna, solarium and qualified instructors. But the family spends £400 a year here. They're also members of a local tennis club.
Did you use felt tips or did you use crayons?
The family eats carefully too, avoiding fatty foods, white bread and too many sweets. Their breakfast of fresh orange juice and cereals is nutritious. But independent studies show that the recommended healthy diet is 35% more expensive than the average weekly shopping bill. But even in Mrs. Currie's ideal southern family, her remarks have not gone down well.
If I lived in the north, I would be outraged. But the fact that I'm a southerner, I'm extremely embarrassed.
Why?
Because I think it's very presumptuous of her to say that, virtually saying that a mother from, or a family from up north do not have the common sense to eat well and to exercise regularly.
But exercising regularly doesn't have to cost money, and the 27,000 people who took part in this year's Great North Run on Tyneside prove there's no lack of enthusiasm for fitness in the north.
A wonderful sight, and it makes you realise why the North East claims to be the capital of running in Great Britain.
Yes, Alan, it's a very infectious part of the world for running, of course. In fact, I think from distance running point of view, it's tended to become the home of distance running in this country.
The drive for fitness extends to the poorest. Newcastle's major sports centre is one of the busiest in Britain, and the unemployed form a large and growing proportion of its users.
I doubt if there are many centres in the country that could have the number of users we have, which is, we have in excess of 1 million people coming through the centre in the course of a year. The biggest change has been in daytime usage. We get a lot more usage now during mornings and afternoons. Obviously related to the employment situation, people have got more spare time.
This fitness centre was opened specifically in response to demands from the less well-off. There are now 1,500 members. 300 use the gym every week, almost all of them out of work.
Well, mainly it's just to keep yourself busy through the day. There's nothing else really to do in this sort of area, so you might as well come to places like this and try to keep yourself fit.
But despite their best efforts, too many people in the north of England will end up here before their time. A final measure of the health of any area is given by its death rate, comparing the number of people who die with the total population. In the north, it's 15% above the national figure. But it's in premature death, death below the age of 65, that the starkest contrasts emerge. In the worst parts of the north, you're 3 times as likely to die young as in the southeast. The disturbing contrast between the north and south has been highlighted in Professor Townsend's report, giving new impetus to the debate about a divided Britain.
There are a lot of people dying prematurely. There is a real problem for the north, which is more extreme, though it also exists in large measure in the south. The report shows, secondly, the connection between material deprivation and early death.
That connection is made in the report by identifying exactly who it is that die young. It's the poor, the unemployed, and the low-paid. And it seems that the gap in life expectancy between these people and the better off is getting wider.
There are two Britons. The mortality in the north is 15% more on average than the rest of the country. There is more deprivation in the north on various tests. But I think the two Britons is more a polarization between rich and poor in both the north and the south.
The research shows that the well-off in the north today will live long and healthy lives, much as in the affluent south. But a half-hour journey across the northeast spans half a century of progress in health standards and life expectancy. Dr. Peter Phillimore has organized much of the research for the controversial report.
Obviously, the health of the country as a whole has improved enormously since the 1930s, and in that sense, we're poles apart from the position we were in then. But within the north, the best and worst areas are 50 years apart in terms of their health.
Whitley Bay, just a few miles from Newcastle. Wealthy and healthy, too.
Well, this part of Whitley Bay compares quite favourably with many parts of the south, more affluent parts of the south. But what's not so visible is that an area like this also has the same levels of health as many parts of the south.
Wall's End, a few minutes' drive away. Poorer and 30 years behind in standards of health.
In many ways, people's health here compares with that in the country as a whole in the beginning of the 1950s. It's by no means exceptional. There's about 10% of the population of the north live in areas like this. There's certainly deprived areas. I mean, there's above average unemployment. Those who are employed, the income levels are often very low.
A few minutes from the centre of Newcastle, and a trip back nearly half a century in health standards.
When you pass from affluent areas to the poorest areas, the transition in terms of material conditions is very visible, but what isn't so well understood is that there is an enormous transition in terms of health too.
Don't all the studies really show that, in fact, I mean, this is nothing whatever to do with geography, it is to do with poverty and class?
No, the statistics don't show anything as simple as that. If you look at a map of the United Kingdom, if you put the difficult bits in red and the good bits in our terms in green, then you get the red bits in the northeast. They are amongst the worst parts of the country, and they have been for a very long time. Now,
but people would say that that's because there are more poor people there, not because it's the north.
Well, I come from the north of England, and I resent the notion, as indeed do some of the northern newspapers, that all northerners are poor.
Well, nobody's saying that they all are, but there are more poor people. Nobody would deny that, surely.
But I'll say it again, if I may. The health statistics show that there were problems in health in the north, even when more people weren't poor, or even when the north was booming, even when there was plenty of money in the north.
There's always been greater poverty in the north than the south.
And more people have for a very long time been heavier drinkers in the north.
Governments have known that manual workers and the unemployed live shorter lives than white-collar workers since early this century. But in 1980, an official study by the Black Committee gave them still less welcome news. The gap was getting wider. Among the members of the committee was Professor Peter Townsend.
We discovered that material deprivation was the key factor in the explanation for inequalities in health that existed in this country. And the committee looked long and hard at all the explanations for inequalities in health and took the view that undoubtedly material deprivation was the most important thing.
The Black Report was welcomed by the World Health Organization and was made the model for further international research. But at home, it was virtually dismissed.
Well, the Black Report was published in what amounts to a very devious and underhand way. Merely 260 copies were put out, and they weren't even properly printed, on a bank holiday afternoon. And the idea, I think, was that nobody would even notice their appearance.
Why would the government want to publish the report in that way?
The report, of course, had been commissioned by a Labour government, And I think that when it was delivered to the Tories, they didn't like what it showed, and they said quite overtly in their introduction that they didn't think it possible to implement the 37 or so recommendations of the committee, mainly on the grounds they thought it would be far too expensive.
There's more information which throws light on the widening gap between the poor and the affluent, but it's becoming less accessible. Every 10 years for over half a century, governments have published reports on the links between class, work and death. This year, for the first time, the department responsible says the data is unreliable. The report was published without a proper analysis.
When I look at other reports that have been suppressed or published in a rather devious way, then I worry very much that the government is very unwilling to put out data that show that their policies on health aren't working very well.
All right, there's a lot of criticism. Let me show you a different publication that's readily available and that has got all the statistics in clearly understood form. There it is. Ill health is the red bit. That's what happens when you eat the wrong things, drink the wrong things, and smoke too much. That's what happens. I'm not making it up. And if that's
critics
not
would
a
say that you're holding
form,
it up because it proves your point, and not holding up the ones that don't. That's what the critics
everything
say.
we've got, every bit of paper we've got proves my point.
It's like history being repeated from 1979, 1980, and the reaction to the Black Report, that constantly there is a refusal to consider issues of deprivation and poverty, and an interest only in what the individual can do.
A mother and baby clinic in one of the poorest parts of Newcastle. Mrs. Currie came here last week. It could have been an ideal opportunity to consider another aspect of Professor Townsend's report, child health. The report establishes that as many as 1 in 4 babies in poor areas of the north is born underweight. But Mrs. Currie seemed more concerned about the weight of the mothers.
She did say something about she wanted to raise people's self-esteem, and yet our very next comment was that I was carrying too much weight around, which did nothing for my self-esteem.
Effectively, the government minister told you you were too fat. How did you feel about that?
Well, coming from someone who obviously didn't have much of a grip on what the realities of life around here were, it wasn't all that threatening. But I think for someone in her position, it's disgraceful that she should come and talk to people in that way, not perhaps acknowledging the feelings that people have around it.
The link was first made between poverty and poor child health in Newcastle half a century ago. A children's specialist found that poor children were shorter, lighter, and more often sick than the well-off. His findings have been echoed in further reports ever since.
We know that there are 17,000 children in Newcastle who are living in families that are entirely dependent on social security. And that means, without any doubt, in my book, they're living in poverty. Long, grinding poverty. There's no chance for most of them that the parents are ever going to get a job. In the particular part of Newcastle that we're sitting, more than half the men who want to be employed haven't got a job and won't get a job. In Newcastle as a whole, 1 in 5 people is unemployed. So motivation goes for kids from a very young age to lift themselves to other levels. And along with that seems to go, and we have clear evidence of this, a perpetual series of small illnesses growing into larger illnesses because people don't look after themselves properly.
Tea time on Tyneside, and the main meal of the day for Susan and Sidney Whitehead. They've both been without work for 3 months and are bringing up 3 children on the dole.
It's not us that's ignorant, it's Edwina Currie and the government. People try their best to look after their children, to keep them warm, clothed and everything, and it's just very hard to do. You've got to miss paying something like to go and get them a pair of shoes. Edwina Currie, she's going on about having salads and having plenty of fruit. It's all right for her, she's got the money, she's been used to having the money. But for people that's like unemployed or even working class people that's on a low income, they just can't afford to do it. They have to live like on plenty of potatoes and things like that, all the starchy food.
To doctors treating children in some of the poorest parts of Tyneside, a fatty, starchy diet is familiar and seems inevitable.
We can frown on that sort of feeding, but it's a cheap way of filling bellies, and these children are hungry. There's no doubt what they first of all need is to be filled up. Things like meat and vegetables around here are basically a luxury. And a lot of the mothers, you know, they can only afford to fill their children up. They can't afford anything more than that.
Do you manage to buy fruit for the family?
Well, my daughter had to go to the dentist to get her teeth taken out. So I took her there, and the dentist just happened to say, give them more fruit. Well, when we were working, we did used to get plenty of fruit. So I would say for a full week, I went into the shops buying apples, grapes, bananas, pears, and by, say, middle of the week, I looked in my purse and there was nothing there. And it wasn't until I sat down, worked out, the fruit was taking up the money. Money where I used to have like a couple of pounds spare when the next gyro came. But then I thought to myself, well, I can't afford it. I buy them apples, but that's all, I get no more fruit.
We should eat yoghurt. Sorry for her, she gets it for naught. All she has to do is stir in a pint of milk.
The less well-off find it harder to joke about Mrs. Currie's sound advice to cut down on a smoke and a drink. Many of them know they would be healthier and wealthier, but say it's not that easy.
We would both love to stop. We've tried. I mean, you have to have some sort of enjoyment, and to me, a cigarette is enjoyment. I don't drink.
You've often heard them say, it's the only thing that helps me get through the day.
Well, now you'll hear me say that they're wrong, because what this pattern
Well, they won't appreciate that very much.
I have to say it. My job is not just to run the health service and to pick up the pieces of the people that arrive at the doors of the hospital. My job is to ask how those pieces happened in the first place.
You can see the reaction to your remarks. It's just been anger, hurt, upset.
No, there hasn't just been anger and hurt. There have been a lot of letters and leaders and comments, particularly in the northern newspapers, from people saying, absolutely right.
But there was little praise for Mrs. Currie on the streets of Newcastle last week.
I was offended, definitely. I know how hard it is bringing my family up, my husband's working.
It was very offensive, especially for people trying to bring up kids on the money. The deprivation is in the northeast at the moment.
Oh, I think a lot of people were offended. God, who does she think she is?
To many people, it seems so strange that you don't see how offensive it is to say to these people, look at people down south, how virtuous they are. Why can't you be like them? It's incredibly offensive, isn't it?
I don't think it's offensive to say to somebody, looking him straight in the eye, that if you spend your hard-earned money on smoking very heavily, as people do in some parts of the north, on drinking 10, 14 pints a day and thinking that that's macho and masculine, and then on going home and eating a diet that's deficient in vegetables or in fruit or in all the other good things that are not expensive, I don't think it is patronising or aggressive or offensive to say to him, don't blame me if you end up with cancer or heart disease.